Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the chance to be in the Rules Committee. I don't frequent this room, but I feel quite at home with so many of my colleagues from the Judiciary Committee also serving on this panel. Mr. Chairman, January 6th was not a good day. But to my knowledge, there's been no charge of insurrection or terrorism. Largely, the charges that have been levied against those who were involved in breaking the law result in property damage charges. And it's my expectation that if there are folks who broke the law, they should be treated no better or no worse than anyone else who breaks these particular laws. But all of this is ridiculous. Mr. Chairman, the American people are in trouble. I was recently in Qatar on a bipartisan delegation led by Mr. Issa, and we learned directly that thousands upon thousands of Afghans were let into our country with principally no vetting, no screening. The general we met with at the base in Doha said that refugees were merely handed a blank sheet of paper, and whatever they wrote on it was deemed their paper passport. And people are concerned about that. On our border, we functionally have a turnstile. I never believed that President Biden could be worse than President Obama on the border, but we've gone from the Obama days of catch and release to the Biden days of import and release, where people are being really beckoned across the border as a consequence of our policies and then shuttled around the country. And our supply chain issues have come to the forefront of the minds of so many of Americans. I mean, supply chain used to be something people learned about in economics class. And now the supply chain issues are resulting in inadequate access to things that people need. And we see the Washington Post tell Americans to just lower their expectations regarding the American economy. I was recently at the Port of Long Beach. I saw just, cargo ship after cargo ship. You could about walk from the Port of Long Beach to the Channel Islands in California without ever having your feet touch the water on cargo ships that cannot come into port because of a total failure of the U.S. economy. Our country has been humiliated abroad in Afghanistan, where reliance on this strategy of an Afghan government being left to facilitate American departure and withdrawal turned out to be a total fiction. And yet here we are reviewing Steve Bannon's podcast. The average American, when they wake up, I don't think one of the first 100 things they think about is Steve Bannon's podcast, the things he said before or after January 6th. I think that is a uniquely Washington obsession. And it wouldn't be so damaging to our country if it wasn't absorbing the capacity of the Congress to meet the actual challenges that the American people are facing. I mean, do you really think that your constituents are out there hoping that you guys are here sharing your hot takes on Steve Bannon's podcast rather than dealing with the inflation that is crushing them, the border crisis that is concerning them, the problems we have abroad? It's truly shameful that this is got the focus and the obsession of so many in the Congress. There's been discussion today about Mr. Bannon's response being one of total and complete defiance. I believe those are the words that my colleague from Colorado used. But that's not true. Mr. Bannon simply wants claims of executive privilege to be resolved. And I am not competent to resolve those questions. I don't know if those claims are meritorious or not. But I do think that a person, when presented with such demands from the January 6th committee, might reasonably want those questions to be resolved in the absence of some total and complete defiance. We saw this in the Don McGahn scenario, where once the constitutional questions and legal issues were resolved, Mr. McGahn came in and we were able to have an interview. Much has been said today about the failing institutions in America and who is to blame for them. So many of my colleagues on the left talk about Trump being this savage against our institutions and that our institutions are all going to fail because of Trump and the insurrectionist Republicans. But truly, this is a case of projection. After the 2016 election, Democrats repeatedly called President Trump an illegitimate president. They damaged the institution of our electoral process by claiming that Trump was a Russian agent. How phony and fake that all turned out to be. We've even seen the Democrats back institutions that have done great violence to our sense of justice. When the FBI was changing evidence in a secret court to go after President Trump and his allies, they certainly were able to rely on my colleagues on the left to have their back. And the US dollar is a pretty important institution to American families, and the policies being considered by the majority in this Congress would crush the dollar. It would punish savers and seniors, leading to massive inflation, getting people caught with real impact on their lives that go beyond your perception of Steve Bannon's podcast. So this week, it is the institution of Congress that is failing to meet the needs of the people. But in the prior panel, we heard Chair Thompson and Congresswoman Cheney really give up the game, because this isn't about a contempt proceeding. Everything the American people are watching today is about the inward turning of our national security apparatus and law enforcement against political rivals. Mr. Thompson, Chairman Thompson, talked about criminal contempt referrals. I would proffer to the committee that Chairman Thompson knows exactly why he made that statement, because he knows there are willing hands at the Department of Justice ready to receive such a referral and to criminalize our politics. Mr. Bannon wants to wait to see if there is a privilege issue resolved by a court, and as a consequence, this is all just theater to set up the utilization of criminal process against Steve Bannon. We also heard Congresswoman Cheney echo those very themes. In her comments regarding Leader McCarthy, someone that I don't agree with in all circumstances, Congresswoman Cheney said that Mr. McCarthy had been especially active in blocking the January 6th committee. Those words were chosen on purpose because obstructing a congressional investigation, as we all know, is a crime. And so this isn't about Mr. McCarthy's discussions, this isn't about his perspective, this isn't about his votes or his speeches. This is about setting up people like Steve Bannon and Kevin McCarthy for criminal process. And the American people need to know that has begun now. It began in that committee, and this is another step along the way to criminalize political activity. But the American people should also know it's not just the Kevin McCarthys and the Steve Bannons that are going to be targeted. It's not just going to be the powerful and the rich and the famous and people you see on TV. And the tell for that is that the federal government is going to be reviewing transactions over $600. That's what they want to do. And the whole reason that's the case is because it's not going to be an effort exclusively against those with money and power. It is going to be an effort against regular Americans to criminalize their politics. My friends, Democrats need January 6th right now more than ever. They need it because they can't pass a bill. I mean, this isn't Republicans. This was the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, and others in the Blue Dog Caucus saying, we were promised a vote on the infrastructure bill, and it is a betrayal of the trust that we have with Speaker Pelosi that vote didn't occur. So here we are. You can't get an infrastructure bill. You can't get a reconciliation bill. You can't meet the needs of the country. The border is a mess. Afghans are coming in unvetted. The dollar is crumbling. The economy is failing. Supply chain issues are hurting Americans' families. And you desperately need to obsess about January 6th. I would suggest that you need to move on, and the American people are ready to move on. But if we are going to obsess about calls for violence, it would be important to note that there's a good amount of hypocrisy in this Democrat-led effort. For example, when Congresswoman Maxine Waters called on Democrats to physically intimidate President Trump's cabinet officials, there was no such effort for contempt or review or committees or commission. Congresswoman Waters said, let's make sure we show up wherever we have to show up. And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome anymore. It was a Democrat Missouri state senator who said, I hope Trump is assassinated. It was former Attorney General Eric Holder who said, no, when they go low, we kick them, referring to Republicans. Physical kinetic energy against your political opponents. Speaker Pelosi called President Trump an imposter and said it is dangerous to allow the American voters to evaluate his performance in the 2020 election. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley urged unrest on the streets. She said, you know, there needs to be unrest in the streets as long as there is unrest in our lives. We saw our country face violence and vandalism for months during the summer of 2020. Where was the commission to evaluate that unfortunate activity? In 2017, Speaker Pelosi said, our election was hijacked. There is no question. Congress has a duty to protect our democracy and follow the facts. So I guess in that case, protecting our democracy meant destabilizing the presidency. And now, all of this pomp and circumstance to preserve it. We heard Speaker Pelosi also say, quote, I'm counting down the hours till he's gone. I plan to pull him out of there by his hair, his little hands and feet. Governor Cuomo talked about physical violence that New Yorkers ought to engage in against President Trump. He said, quote, he can't have enough bodyguards to walk through New York City. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer said 86-45. Get it? Senator Warren actually sent up a meme that called for MAGA death. So again, I sense from the was that time expiring, Mr. Chairman? There's no time limit? All right, well, I'm sort of just getting, I got a little more to lean in here.
We don't have a time limit in the Rules Committee, although we should rethink it.
Hey, anytime I can inspire congressional reform, I'm always eager to do so. You know, again, Mr. Chairman, time and again, we see these calls for violence. We see actual violence that was far more grave and far more damaging to our country throughout the summer of 2020 than the unfortunate acts on a bad day on January 6th. And I would encourage the committee and the Congress to do what the American people have done, move on from this, and let's focus on the actual issues that affect them. And I appreciate the committee's indulgence, and I yield back.